Hey, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Starr here with you guys. Welcome back. We are getting into today nationalism and how nationalism has impacted Europe. We've talked a lot about nationalism throughout trimester 2 as well, but now getting into kind of some of the effects of what happened after the French Revolution and the idea of nationalism spread across Europe and then beyond Europe. All right, so we're going to be getting into some of these I can statements today, looking at how nationalism contributed to the consequences and the causes of World War I, and then how imperialism led to the same thing, and then how militarism also kind of came to encompass some of the causes and consequences of World War I as well. All right, so here we go. When we start off looking at the impacts of Napoleon, right, going all the way back to the French Revolution that we talked about. Napoleon and what happened here in France at that time kind of sowed the seeds of nationalism. We saw that many small German-speaking states were established afterwards, and they decided, and with the impact of Napoleon here, they decided that they could actually work together to fight against him. And so that showed a sense of nationalism for those small German-speaking states. Prussia, who was the largest German-speaking state at that time, they decided that they wanted to promote unity and nationalism. And so they tried to bring all those small German-speaking states together and eventually unify them into what we know as Germany today. And so after the fall of Napoleon, the second fall anyway, they have the Congress of Vienna. And if you remember back to second trimester, the Congress of Vienna was all about trying to prevent a strong France from rejoining and reforming again. And so they wanted to divide up power in Europe again. Well, Germany at this time added some of the land, or the German states anyway, added land to those German states from what France had controlled at one point. And so they added the area around the Rhine River. They dissolved the Holy Roman Empire because it wasn't really working. It didn't really exist at that point anymore. And Austria also gained control of some of the southern portions of those German-speaking states. That's the yellow on our map right there. So you can see all those states that are kind of the greenish and light greenish states that are between the Austrian Empire, Poland, Kingdom of Prussia, Bavaria. Those are all German-speaking territories for the most part. All right. And so the idea of Prussia was to eventually try to unify all those German-speaking areas together. So one man is basically responsible for becoming essentially the architect of unifying all those German states, and his name is Otto von Bismarck. And so when we talk about Otto von Bismarck, he was the prime minister of Prussia in 1862, and he used a policy called blood and iron to try to unite the German territories together. All right, we'll talk more about blood and iron here shortly. He also used something that we call realpolitik, which basically means that in his eyes, the ends always justified the means. All right, so whatever he did to try to unite the people of Germany, if it worked in the end, then he's justified in doing it, even if it is going to war with other countries. And so that's kind of where the blood and the iron comes from here, is bringing people together through warfare, essentially, and through industrialization. And so he worked to strengthen the army of Prussia, and Prussia had basically become the strongest army in Europe, if not the world at this time, under Otto von Bismarck. And he started to expand Prussian territory. He gained more power, and Prussia gained more power throughout Europe. And eventually, his goal, is to try to destroy Austria. They are what's standing in the way, in his mind, of uniting the German-speaking people of Europe. Okay. And so when we look at this, his plan essentially has three major aspects to it. All right. He believes that he needs to have victory in three different wars. And so Bismarck used war in order to build up the Prussian country, or the Prussian state. And so you can see Prussia was at one point kind of the light green territory. And yes, they were disconnected from each other, but those were all Prussia. And over time, he worked to unite the purple areas and the dark green area together. And so in order to do that, he went first into battle and took the provinces of Schleswig and Holstein, which are in the northern portion there, kind of near Denmark. He took those in battle for Prussia. So Prussia came in and conquered those territories. Then later on, in another war in 1866, it was a 7-week-long war, he went to war with Austria. And again, Prussia came out victorious. And with that, he was able to take some of the other northern states that were involved here as well. Finally, the last war that he believed he needed to win was a war with France. And so they call that the Franco-Prussian War. This one gets a little tricky. In fact, Bismarck actually tricks the French into declaring war. France didn't want to declare war against anyone. And so he wanted to make sure that they were able to declare war so that they looked like the aggressor instead of Prussia looking like the aggressor. So basically, what he did was he intercepted a telegram that was coming from Austria, the King of Austria, to the French and the French ambassador. And in that telegram, he edited it to make it look like the Austrian king was insulting the French ambassador. All right. The French, when they finally got the letter, they were so upset that they declared war against Austria. All right. Now, during all this, Prussia is just kind of waiting to swoop in and take on the French army, and so that's exactly what happens. The Prussians swoop in. France doesn't even know who they're fighting in this war. They think they're fighting Austria. Austria has no idea what's going on. Prussia swoops in, takes out the French military very quickly, and they win. And they're able to take those kind of greenish states like Alsace and Lorraine and some of those other dark green states right there, eventually become united as part of this German-speaking Prussian territory. All right, this war is going to come back. This Franco-Prussian War is going to come back to haunt Germany later on when we get to World War I and beyond. All right, so we'll talk more about that one later. So we also look at now the creation of the German Empire. So Otto von Bismarck has now basically, with his victories in those three different wars, established this German-speaking territory. So in 1871, the southern portion and northern portion of those German states combined together. And with that, they named Wilhelm I of Prussia the new Kaiser of what they called the Second Reich. All right, so this is the German Empire being established. Why are they calling themselves the Second Reich? Because in their minds, they're basically continuing the Roman Republic or the Roman Empire. They are like the second Roman Empire. That's what kind of the Second Reich means here. All right. So they create a constitution, and in that constitution, there's a two-house legislature. You have the Bundesrat, which is the appointed upper house, and you have the Reichstag, which is the male-elected lower house. So it's kind of like the United States, right? You've got the Senate and the House of Representatives. Same thing here with the Bundesrat and the Reichstag. But in this case, all the real power basically lies in the hands of the Kaiser and the Chancellor. So there's two people that are kind of the executive section here: the Kaiser. And then the Chancellor. The Kaiser, the word Kaiser is kind of a play on the idea of the word Caesar. All right, that's where we get to the Second Reich there as well. And then the Chancellor, who we already talked about before, being Otto von Bismarck, was the Prime Minister. He's actually going to fall into that Chancellor role as well. So you've got Wilhelm I and you have Otto von Bismarck here in our two leadership roles. And so those two men together work to strengthen Germany. And so when we look at the second stage, we talked about blood and iron policy of Otto von Bismarck. The blood was these battles that he had to fight, these wars. The iron portion was creating this industrial power, so industrializing the German state at this point. And so they went through all these different economic growth at this time and this explosion of power. And so they also tried to industrialize. So coal and iron became extremely important. They had abundant supplies of those things. They wanted to educate their workforce, and so they were able to do that through education programs. The government helped to promote science, similar to what we saw in Great Britain when they were starting to industrialize. And then finally, we see that all this growth is going to lead to a very strong Prussia. And so that man right there, Otto von Bismarck, is named the Iron Chancellor, like we just talked about. He's named the Chancellor of Germany at this time. And so Bismarck basically crushes all those people that opposed him, any of those other parts of the state that were reluctant to become kind of this unified entity. He crushes those opponents. He tries to crush the Catholic Church, which doesn't work super well for him. But he crushes the socialists, people that were kind of against him, but he also wanted some of the reforms that they had. And basically, he ushers in this new change in government. So with the reforms that the socialists wanted, he keeps things like health insurance and old age retirement for people. All right. So that's how we have the creation of Germany. Up until this point, guys, we haven't had a Germany. There was never a German state at this point, or Germany, up until this point when we look at Otto von Bismarck and then the Kaiser Wilhelm. Okay. The other state in Europe that we are familiar with and we think has always been there is Italy, but it hasn't. Prior to this, Italy was Rome, right? And so now we're looking at unifying Italy, as well. And so when we look at the Italian unification, it's a little bit different than what we just saw with the German unification. Something that's used here in Italy is what they call the Risorgimento, which is this resurgence. And so it's a nationalist movement, basically, where they were trying to bring together the people of Italy, largely because Austria, for a long time, being their northern neighbor, really didn't want to see Italy unified together. And so the nationalists of the movement here, the nationalist movement in Italy, worked in secret to try to bring the people of Italy together and unify the entire country. King Emmanuel II and Count Cavour are two of the men in the northern portion of Italy that were working to unite all the northern provinces of Italy together. And they ally with each other, and they ally with France to try to push Austria out of some of the Italian, what they believed were Italian regions in the north. And so with France, they fight off the Austrian Empire here in the Lombardy region. And that's kind of one of the first actions that we see in them trying to unite Italy. In the southern portion, there's another man here who is working on his own nationalist movement, and his name is Garibaldi. That's him in the picture right there. Garibaldi and his army was known as the Thousand Red Shirts. They took the island of Sicily for Italy. And then they continued to kind of work their way around the boot of Italy, kind of unifying those territories as well. And so you had King Emmanuel and Count Cavour in the north working with France, and you had Garibaldi and his red shirts in the south working to unify the southern portion. And the two entities are going to kind of push and meet towards the middle. And so you can see kind of our resurgence. So again, you've got a group in the north, you've got a group in the south pushing to meet each other here. And so with that, a new nation is born. We have an Italy that is finally created. And so in the year 1870, they do unite the entire Italian peninsula and Sicily. Okay, so what we know as Italy today. They did run into some problems, and that is number one, a lot of tension between church and state. The church, right, the Catholic Church, has been the dominant power in that region for a long, long time. And so they ran into some problems with church and state, right, this creation of this new Italian state at this time. There was also some issues between socialists and conservatives, people that wanted to kind of keep things the way they were versus kind of push for social reforms. And we also saw there was some people that wanted anarchy. All right, so there were some anarchists that were involved that really didn't think that they needed a centralized government at all throughout Italy. But eventually they're able to push through some of these problems. One of the biggest problems they have, though, is tensions between the northern portion and the southern portion of Italy. The northern portion for a long time was much more industrialized, and the southern portion was much more agrarian. It was more of an agricultural society, a lot like the United States, right? Where you see in the north, we were much more industrialized. In the south, it was much more agrarian or agricultural. And so that is a big tension. We also see differences in kind of ethnicities to some extent between North and South Italy. And we also see some differences in culture between those two. But they are eventually able to push through, and they are able to unify all of Italy together. And so when we look at that, other parts of Europe are going to face issues with nationalism. So Germany, or the German-speaking territories, unite together to form Germany. The Italian provinces are able to unite together to form Italy. But in some parts of Europe, nationalism worked the opposite way. These old empires that existed, like Austro-Hungarian Empire, or or if we're going to get to it right now, the Ottoman Empire, they started to break apart because of this. You have multiple different ethnic groups and nationalities that wanted their own sovereignty. They wanted a say in their own government, and they wanted their own nation states, essentially. And so we're going to see a breakup of some of these large old empires. So when we talk about Austria-Hungary, they had over 8 different major nationalities of people. And so it was really difficult for Austria-Hungary to stay united during this time. So Austria and Hungary eventually split. And so you get 2 different states. You get Austria and you get Hungary instead of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Ottoman Empire also has this issue. They eventually fall into chaos. The Balkans here, this territory you see on the map, becomes basically what they consider like the powder keg of Europe. We're eventually going to see that it explodes. And with that explosion, we're going to see all kinds of ethnic and national issues going on in the Balkan region. And ultimately, it's this region that will lead us into World War I. All right, and so we'll talk about that a little bit more later on here. There's your powder keg aspect. So again, that region, the Balkans, always in crisis. All right, and so the Ottoman Empire find it very difficult to maintain their control over that region as well. So the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire are starting to break apart because of that nationalism threat. Okay. Again, good in Germany and Italy to unite the people. not so good for those old empires of Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. So that kind of wraps things up, ladies and gentlemen. You might want to just be able to kind of answer these couple questions. You don't have to turn them in, but I would just kind of take note. You should be able to define nationalism by this point. We've talked about it in Try 2. We're talking about it now again. And then you should be able to kind of give us an idea of how nationalism started to change Europe between 1800 all the way up to World War I here. All right. So if you have any questions, guys, be sure to talk to your teacher. Otherwise, I will see you again soon.